This is Jed Disler, and welcome to the Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Consider taking out a paid subscription to the Piano Maven podcast through my Substack page, and I have provided a link to do so in our episode description. Paid subscribers get a free download at the beginning of each month, and your support will help keep this podcast alive and thriving. One of our listeners wrote to me asking if I could recommend a recording of the Burleske for Piano and Orchestra by Richard Strauss. It's easy to consider this work to be something outside of the standard concerto repertoire, perhaps because it doesn't turn up as often on concerts compared to, let's say, the Beethoven or Brahms or Liszt or Chopin or Rachmaninoff concertos. But more pianists than you would suspect have championed the Burleske, and it did turn up more than a few times during the 78 era on disc. Generally, the Burleske has been quite lucky on disc. And before I talk about the recordings, I'll give you a little bit of background information. The original title that Strauss gave to this work was Scherzo in D minor, and he wrote it for Hans von Bülow to play. It was von Bülow who had appointed Strauss as the assistant conductor of the Meiningen Court Orchestra. But when Hans von Bülow looked at the score of the Burleske, he called it a complicated piece of nonsense, and he refused to learn it. And he said that the piano part was Lisztian, like Franz Liszt, and he said that it was unplayable, particularly for a pianist with a small hand span like he had. So Strauss set the work aside, but then he presented it in 1889 to the pianist Eugene d'Albert, the Liszt pupil. Eugene d'Albert liked the work, although he did suggest that Strauss make a few cuts and some changes to the piano part. So he revised it a bit, and he rededicated the work to Eugene d'Albert, who premiered it under its new official title, the Burleske, on June 21st, 1890. And this was actually on the same concert on which Strauss's tone poem, Death and Transfiguration, had its world premiere. Interesting fact. Hans von Bülow, in the meantime, took a look at the revised version that's now called the Burleske, but he still did not like it, although he did conduct it with Eugene d'Albert playing the solo part. Eventually, Strauss agreed to publish the Burleske, and it appeared in 1894. It took him decades to finally warm up to the piece, but I think eventually he came to really enjoy his youthful creation. And in fact, he programmed the Burleske in his last concert in London in September 1947. That concert happened to have been preserved, and we're going to talk about that performance of the Burleske in due course. I'm not going to do a complete discographical discussion, but we're going to cover a decent amount of recordings, many of which I can recommend. But we're going to start in the 78 era and tap into the mono LP era. The very first commercial recording of the Burleske was made in 1932, and it features pianist Ellie Nye with her husband Wilhelm von Hoogstraten conducting the Berlin State Opera Orchestra. And the best way that I could describe this performance is a tug of war, or maybe a clash of wills, because the conductor sets insanely fast tempos that his wife really can't cope with. I mean, she's not a disaster, but her technique is definitely pressed to its limits. And the sonics are pretty murky, even by 1932 standards. But if you want a pianist who can cut the mustard at fast tempos, you got to go to Claudio Arau's recording from 1946 with Désiré Defoe conducting the Chicago Symphony. This is a really exciting and swashbuckling recording. It's interesting that Arau kept the burlesque in his repertoire up to his old age, but curiously, he never recorded it in long-playing format. There are lots of air checks that float around with Arau playing the burlesque from his later years. But this version from 78, from 1946, still really packs a punch. The French pianist Marcel Meyer performed the burlesque under the composer's baton, believe it or not, in the early 1930s. But when she recorded the work in 1943, it was with André Cloitin and the Paris Conservatory Orchestra. The sound quality is a little dry, but it's certainly clear and close up. And here it's the orchestra that has to work to keep up with the pianist rather than the other way around, especially in the music's more boisterous passages. Friedrich Gould recorded the burlesque in the early 1950s. I just recently talked about that big box set of the complete Gould on 84 CDs, and the burlesque is a part of that collection. This is a marvelous recording from Gould's point of view. I mean, his finger work is so incisive in those zippy, virtuosic passages, but he also sings out the lyrical episodes beautifully. He's on very inspired form. But Anthony Collins is not the most brilliant or inspired conductor in the universe, and the London Symphony Orchestra is not on their best form. Basically, the orchestra and the conductor kind of function as a doormat. But if you really want to hear a great orchestra and conductor in the mono LP era, you go to Eugene Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra, and they just play this music fantastically, teaming up with pianist Rudolf Serkin. And this was the first Serkin-Ormandy collaboration in the burlesque on disc. This performance has wonderful nervous energy and edge-of-seat excitement from everyone's part. And fine as their stereo remake was, I think this earlier mono version is fresher, and it's actually better balanced in terms of engineering. It's perfectly fine mono. I really love this recording. But Fritz Reiner and the Chicago Symphony have the advantage of late 1950s living RCA Victor stereo, plus the virtuosity of Byron Janis, who brings interesting accentuations to the table and a really strong left-hand presence. But there's another burlesque from a broadcast of a performance that has Fritz Reiner conducting, and it's with the orchestra that he music directed prior to Chicago, meaning the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra. And his soloist was the legendary William Capell. And apparently Reiner asked Capell to prepare the burlesque, and basically the pianist had 3 or 4 days' notice. It was not a very happy occasion, but Capell wanted the gig, and he felt the pressure. Amazingly, he learned the piece wonderfully well. You know, for 4 days' notice in this live broadcast performance, there are occasional rough edges, but all things considered, it is really kind of remarkable. Maybe you can understand why the Capell family was reluctant to sanction this performance for release, because the pianist did express great unhappiness about the experience. But when it became clear that there was not ever going to be another William Capell Strauss burlesque, the family eventually gave permission. And the sound quality is not great, but enough does come across to show that even with such short notice to learn the piece, William Capell could really deliver the goods with authority. Unfortunately, I don't think that the burlesque constitutes the strongest of the recorded collaborations between Ferenc Fricksoy, the great Hungarian conductor, and the pianist Margaret Weber. She's not so secure in certain parts, and the orchestra is not so spot-on precise as in the Frickshoy and Weber studio recording of the Rachmaninoff Rhapsody on the theme of Paganini, which is one of the greatest recordings of that piece ever made. Glenn Gould loved to play the burlesque during his concertizing days. He never made a commercial recording of it, but he did perform it on television in 1967, after he had stopped giving concerts. And this performance did come out on CD, the audio soundtrack to the TV show. Gould does tend to swoon over lyrical passages, and the sound quality is a little dry and constricted. And you have the Toronto Symphony Orchestra led by Vladimir Golshman, who was one of Gould's favorite collaborators. But there is a pianistically stronger and better sounding Glenn Gould burlesque that took place in Baltimore with Peter Herman Adler leading the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. This was a live performance recorded January 3rd, 1962. It came out on the Music and Arts label, but it quickly disappeared from the catalog, although I'm sure secondhand copies float around of this performance. The Baltimore Symphony back then was not the world-class orchestra that it would become, but it is the best audio representation that I know of Glenn Gould in the Strauss burlesque. Oh, I forgot. I should have mentioned the live performance from October 19th, 1947, from London's Royal Albert Hall, with Richard Strauss himself conducting the Philharmonia Orchestra, who play like crazy for the composer. And the exceptional piano soloist in this performance of the burlesque is Alfred Blumen. He was an Austrian pianist who had a fairly respectable career, and he was an acquaintance of Strauss. Although I think that Daniel Barenboim can be a little impetuous and slapdash at times, in his recording of the burlesque with Zubin Mehta conducting the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, the orchestra support is absolutely superb and full of power and bite, and I only wish that it had been Mehta in front of the orchestra instead of Claudio Abbado for a live Berlin performance with Martha Argerich, who probably gives the most technically proficient rendition of the burlesque on disc. I don't think Abbado matches Zubin Mehta's Fire in the Belly, although for tonal sumptuousness you cannot fault Abbado at all. So in his way he gives marvelous support, and of course the Berlin Philharmonic play wonderfully well. I should quickly mention another historic recording, because this was on my list, but it almost slipped my mind. The sonics of this recording are close up and kind of in your face, but I think the performance is strong and exciting. It has George Georgescu conducting. It's from 1961, and the piano soloist is Sviatoslav Richter, and he is out for blood, let me tell you. Although the piano that he's playing on does not sound like it's the greatest instrument ever constructed. When I reviewed Marc-André Hamelin's recording of the burlesque for Hyperion, I said that he was Bugs Bunny to Martha Argerich's Daffy Duck, meaning that he was cool and collected and poised and full of impeccable timing and wit, as opposed to Argerich being, Argerich being Argerich and being such a force of nature. But the recording by Joseph Moog of the burlesque may even be more witty and impish in comparison with Hamelin. I mean, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But I was very, very impressed with that recording, and I go back and forth between Hamelin and Joseph Moog. However, there was an amazing recording that came out a few years ago. I was very impressed by the astonishing control and the sheer technical elan and style that Bertrand Chamayou brought to this piece, and he takes tempos that are near breakneck. Antonio Pappano is conducting the Santa Cecilia Orchestra, and both he and the piano soloist manage to convey tension and geniality at the same time, which is easier said than done, I guess. And this recording, by the way, is coupled with a good but not especially memorable performance of the Strauss tone poem Ein Heldenleben. So you really want this disc mainly for the burlesque. And this performance with Shamayu inches up to the top of my recent contenders list, alongside Hamelin and Joseph Moog and Martha Argerich. However, and you know that I had to get to my however selection. I sound like David Hurwitz, right? However, for the best integrated soloist conductor team, and for the most prodigious orchestral color and the most mindful virtuosity among all piano soloists. I know I use the phrase mindful virtuosity over and over again. It's a Jed Disler cliche. But I bet you know where I'm going with this introduction. My reference Burleske is with the pianist Malcolm Frager and Rudolf Kempe conducting the Staatskapelle Dresden. And this is a recording where everything comes together. All of the tempos and transitions feel just right. Every theme conveys its own character, and everyone puts their best foot forward, or rather their best hands and fingers and arms and baton forward. Malcolm Frager's sense of rhythmic pointing and his imaginative, yet always tasteful and stylishly appropriate, expressive inflections imbue the piano part with so much variety, and the early 1970s engineering still sounds fantastic. And talk about those Dresden woodwinds and the wonderful horns. Rudolf Kempe was one of the greatest colorists among conductors, and he was one of the greatest Richard Strauss interpreters ever. You have to get that box set that was from Warner Classics, and it's been available on several labels, of Strauss's orchestral music. I think it was 8 or 9 discs with Kempe and the Staatskapelle Dresden, and the Burleske is part of that set. But you can get the Burleske by itself, but I would recommend that whole set because it has some of the most extraordinary Strauss interpretations ever captured by a recording device. So explore these recommendations and see what performance of the Burleske you prefer. I really couldn't live without all of these recent versions and, most of the historic ones that I've talked about. So check it out, and really, if you don't know this piece, you are in for a treat. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. I look forward to being with you for our next episode.